I'm going to walk you through the report today. So, if you are on this call, you already know that climate change poses immense risks to the people and places we love. And we're already seeing these consequences, whether in prolonged droughts, in really strong storms, in more fire weather. This past year has been a really tough one for many of the communities we all hold close. But I want to take a second to focus on how climate impacts the financial sector, how it's going to continue to impact our economy, and how finance campaigners talk about climate change. So, a central argument of our report and our work more broadly is that climate change is a systemic risk. This means that it impacts the whole economy, and there isn't a smart investment strategy that helps investors avoid it. Some of the impacts that we're going to see include things like widespread property destruction from rising waters or wildfires, reduced crop yields as the climate changes, persistent unsafe working conditions where it's too hot too many days in a row. And on top of this, we have transition risks for companies that are unprepared for a changing energy economy. We have legal risks, regulatory risks, and reputational ones as well. So, to put a number on this, global financial institutions have been trying to understand the impact of climate change on the overall economy, and the projections range from an 11 to 25% reduction in global economic output by 2050. 2 weeks ago, a new report came out that shows a 50% reduction in GDP between 2070 and 2090 if we take no further action on climate change. And these big economic repercussions are going to show up in people's retirement savings, and they threaten the ability of investors and especially public pension funds to deliver on the promise of a retirement and the economic security that today's workers and tomorrow's workers deserve. But investors are not without the tools to face these risks. In fact, they have enormous power to shape the economy and support a smooth energy transition. And we like to think about this in three different buckets. The first is what we're going to spend the most time on today, which is wield investor influence. As investors, public pension funds can hold polluting companies accountable through proxy voting, through directly engaging with companies, and much more. They can also shift their investments. While this won't help them avoid economic impacts or economy-wide impacts, it does help shift capital into climate solutions, and they can move money out of fossil fuels. And then lastly, we have hold Wall Street accountable. Pensions are Wall Street's biggest clients, and their managers need to be acting in their best interest. And these strategies that public pension funds champion can influence the entire investor ecosystem. So we're going to talk mostly about proxy voting today, and want to take a moment to define it for folks who are new to this. So as investors, if you buy a share or invest in a public company, you get certain rights. These are called shareholder rights. And that includes at each public company's annual general meeting, voting on the board of directors and on resolutions, which can be brought forward by the company or more often are filed by other investors. And these proposals help investors weigh in on what are smart business practices or what are risks that investors are concerned about that they want to see the company take action on. And larger investors own more shares, which are more votes at these annual general meetings. And so bigger investors have an outsized influence on companies. And these are some of the key issues that we're seeing investors weigh in on at public companies. They include whether or not they're climate leaders on the board of directors with the relevant expertise needed to guide these companies through the energy transition. There are many resolutions on greenhouse gas emissions, asking for disclosures, for setting targets, for aligning the company with the Paris Agreement. There are resolutions about investing in clean energy, the environmental justice impacts of the company, whether or not the policies in place at that company are adequately supporting Indigenous people's rights to free, prior, and informed consent, whether the company has a just transition plan for bringing its workers along through any company changes, and then protecting biodiversity. So, public pension funds and other investors are voting on thousands of votes every single year. And in order to manage all of those, they have internal policies called proxy guidelines. And these lay out what an investor or the public pension believes are responsible business practices, are the risks they're most concerned about, and the actions they'd like companies to take. And the stronger these guidelines are, the stronger the voting record is going to be. And we've already touched on this a little bit, but why do we care about public pension funds as investors? And this first point here, we already talked a little bit about, but pensions must protect and grow workers' retirement savings for decades to come. They're equally interested in serving someone who is already retired and someone who's starting work next year. And so this makes us natural allies in thinking about the preserving economic health for all of us for the long term. And then public pension funds manage the retirement savings of public employees. I imagine many of you have worked for the state or do work for a state and have held some sort of job in the public sector at some point. And if it's not you, it could be a family member, your neighbor. These are our community members, and this is a significant portion of the population that relies on pension benefits. And so these are people that we can work with and are often in our own groups. And then again, public pensions are some of the biggest clients and investors on Wall Street, so their actions really matter for shaping the public discourse on investment practices. And then this is an opportunity, especially for us who focus primarily on climate, to grow our coalitions and really work with our labor partners, work with others who are taking on different aspects of economic risk, whether that's inequality or worker protections, and to build an understanding of how our public pensions can best serve their communities. And then, why do we need to report on this? Well, I've talked a lot about how climate poses a risk to the economy and to investments, but there is a rise in what's called anti-ESG legislation and executive actions that restrict the ability of investors to look at responsible practices and consider things like climate change or inequality in their either investment decisions or in their proxy voting. And so this increase in rhetoric makes it all the more important that we are championing this issue. But unfortunately, that pressure has led to banks and other big financial corporations backsliding on their climate commitments. And investor support overall has been declining a bit for climate resolutions. So it isn't an easy environment to be doing this work, but we do have an opportunity, regardless, to hold polluters accountable and focus on that long-term economic health for all. Okay, so what's in our report. What are we looking at today? The first thing we're looking at are those proxy voting guidelines, that internal policy that determines how public pensions vote. And we look at a number of issues, and they're the different facets of the climate crisis and the different types of risks that we're seeing. And then we assess whether or not those topics are covered within a pensions guidelines and how strong the language is. So this first piece, strength of support, does it say we will support this type of resolution, or are there more qualifications of on a case-by-case basis we will consider this resolution? And then are public pensions just seeking disclosure on a topic, or are they asking the company to adopt targets and policies that will reduce the risks associated with those? And so this, again, this is embargoed until Monday, but this is a preview of the top performing pensions on guidelines. And so New York State Common Retirement Fund is the top of the list here. But you can see that none of these pension funds have perfect scores across the board on all of the topics. But instead, what we're seeing is the best performers cover all of them and have really strong guidelines in a couple different areas, like supporting strong climate resolutions and strong director accountability at companies. And by director accountability, I mean the policy says we will vote against your director if these different standards we have are not in place, if they are not meeting our expectations on certain climate performance criteria. So, on the ballot in 2024. So every year, what topics come up are going to vary a little bit, but this is what we saw last year. And we looked at a number of different sectors. We were able to expand this year, which we were excited about. So we looked at financial institutions, utilities, automakers, steel companies, some consumer goods. And then we also looked at director votes at fossil fuel corporations. And then different themes we looked at were clean energy financing ratios. So this is a resolution type that asked banks to disclose how much they're financing clean energy versus how much they are financing fossil fuels. There's also, as there is every year, many emissions disclosures requests, Paris alignment requests, reports on Indigenous peoples' rights, deep sea mining moratoriums, lobbying expenditure disclosures, and environmental justice assessments. So for our votes, we sorted these by whether or not they focused on disclosure, target setting, or if they were a governance vote. For our purposes, that means whether it was a recommendation to vote against a director for the company's failure to meet certain criteria. And then, of course, we have them by topic. So this is, again, a preview of the top performers on voting. And some of the pensions will be missing from this data because they don't disclose their votes or they did not in time. But yeah, again, we have some pretty strong leadership here on the resolutions. No one got a perfect score again, but what we didn't see was that same leadership on holding directors accountable. And all right, so top line findings from our report. We're really happy to report that Massachusetts, PRIM, and then the Connecticut retirement plans and trust funds improved their proxy voting guidelines from 2023 to 2024, which improved their grades on our rubric very significantly. They added language in that covered biodiversity, that named climate change as a systemic risk, that increased the accountability they expect from boards of directors, and really filled in some gaps that we had seen in their guidelines and move them up in leadership. But on an overall trend, guidelines still remain focused on disclosure. So they're asking companies to say, like, these are our missions, as opposed to saying, we need you to take actionable steps to reduce the risks from either your emissions or any of these other policies we're looking at. And then states with these anti-ESG rules and legislation are lagging on stewardship. And I've been reminded to define ESG for folks. I'm sorry for breezing past this. ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance. And it's just a series or a group of risks that folks in the investment world are looking at that help add in more information that an investor wants to understand the company performance. What's the data related to their environmental performance? How are they treating their workers? How are they interacting with the communities in which they're based? This is a pretty broad characterization, which is part of what makes anti-ESG legislation so dangerous, is that it's really vague and it discourages leadership where there's really clearly defined risk. All right. And then we also saw in underperformance on Indigenous people's rights, environmental justice, biodiversity, and just transition. So a number of these funds have good greenhouse gas emissions expectations, but they're missing these key factors that will influence climate risk. And not only are these going to shape how the economy impacts some of our most vulnerable populations, but they also will shape how well we're able to have a smooth transition that brings all communities along. And then again, pensions are shying away from that board accountability, whether it's in their guidelines or in their votes. I'm going to pass it to Cassie to talk about what we can do.
Thanks, Allie. So now that we're familiar with the important findings and takeaways of this report, I'll cover how pensions can improve their proxy voting and how we can also advocate for them to do so. So first, pension funds can do the following to improve their proxy voting as outlined on this slide. Breadth, pensions should go beyond focusing on greenhouse gas emissions. They should also incorporate language on biodiversity, Indigenous people's rights, and a just transition. Depth, pensions should support resolutions requesting targets and policy adoption and establish board-level accountability measures on climate and transparency. Pensions should disclose voting records publicly, early, and consistently. And lastly, leadership. Pensions should file resolutions, engage with external asset managers, and pre-declare key votes. Next slide, please. The report also includes information specifically on director accountability at oil and gas companies. And this is important because as many who have spent time advocating for pension funds to divest from fossil fuels know, one of the most common arguments that public pension funds provide for staying invested in fossil fuels is that they do not want to give up the influence of shareholder rights for equity owners. This chart, which is a screenshot from the report, shows that some of the loudest proponents of engagement over divestment continue to support directors at companies without credible transition plans. And you may remember that ExxonMobil, in particular, launched an effort last year to stifle shareholder voices. These efforts were denounced by state treasurers, but it is worth noting that only CalPERS voted against the entire board over governance concerns. We hope this information will be helpful for campaigners whose pension funds have statements on engagement versus divestment and folks who are working on divestment. Next slide, please. Yeah, and then this slide is also really important because we want to highlight that this report includes recommendations and model guidelines that may be helpful if you plan to push your pension fund to improve their guidelines. So this is just kind of a screenshot of the recommendations that will be available in the report for campaigners to utilize. Next slide. Yeah, so how can campaigners push for proxy voting guidelines? I'm sure you all are wondering that at this point. So pensions can update their proxy voting guidelines periodically, and staff will bring new language for the Board of Trustees to approve. So it's really important if you're interested in pushing for proxy voting guideline changes to stay in the loop about what your pension fund is doing and any changes they may be making. So you can go to their website that has a lot of information. You can sign up for email updates, check out your fund's latest reports where they may include information about proxy voting, check out like the contact page and find ways to contact your fund. Or you can also look at event calendars and find opportunities for public engagement. And we'll talk about this at an action hour that's coming up more in the future. Next slide, please. And then direct engagement and campaigning. So if you're ready to hit the ground running and work on some tactics to start on right after you read the report, once it's released, you can share the report with your family, your friends on social media. We'll have a toolkit to help you do so that will be released. You can contact your pension fund's board of trustees and let them know that it's important to you that your pension dollars are helping tackle the climate crisis. You can write a letter to the editor. Again, we're going to have more information about this on our February 20th action hour call to learn more about this, and we'll walk you through the process about how to write an LTE and submit it. And then you can also attend pension board meetings where you can give public comments about the importance of good shareholder voting. And of course, if you don't know where to start or you would like to join a group that is already working on this, you can join the Climate Safe Pensions Network. You can email me, Cassie.Kane@Stand.earth, to join the network calls and the listserv. And there's also a bunch of good information about what's going on in the pensions world. You can join a local organization that is working on divestment or campaigning on pension funds. Go to the Climate Safe Pensions Network's website, and we have a whole page showing where campaigns are active. And you can also join a local Sierra Club chapter, which is doing a lot of great work on pension funds as well. Okay, I will pass it over to Amy for next steps.
Okay, this is very exciting. So we've come to this point in this webinar. Like we're talking about this, we need our pension funds to revamp their proxy voting guidelines so they truly align with climate action. And this means not only showing ambition by casting votes that drive meaningful change during AGM season, but also demanding that asset managers and proxy advisors adopt stronger forward-thinking policies. And if pension funds want to earn a better grade on our scorecard report, they should strive to vote with climate at AGM season and reform their guidelines. Public pensions can transform their substantial voting power into a powerful tool for accountability, ensuring that every vote contributes to a safer climate and a more sustainable future. It's time for our pension funds to lead by example. Pushing for these enhanced things are, that's holding every stakeholder accountable for their role in tackling this global challenge. And as we, get into this Q&A session, listening to Cassie, I want to invite you all to take action and join our movement for climate safe pensions. Organize and build support, stay informed, connect with your peers, come to this action hour in February. Our hope is that you will all use this report to push for updates for proxy voting guidelines and actively engage with your pension funds to vote for crucial resolutions on, climate action, FPIC, EJ, and all of that during AGM season. It's not a one-time effort. And it shouldn't be. It's about achieving lasting policy change that secures the long-term health of our retirement savings and our planet, especially in this current political climate. Your voice and your actions are key to making this change happen. So let's stand together and make sure our pensions vote for a sustainable future and transform our collective power into some really great policy change. So now we're going to open up a little bit of Q&A, and our lovely and amazing press secretary has been pulling some excellent questions for us. And I saw one right off the bat at the beginning that I definitely will answer. Lena asked, how are public pension funds Wall Street's biggest customers by number of people represented or dollars under management? And that's a great question. And for folks that don't know, public pension funds are among Wall Street's biggest customers, primarily because of the sheer size of the assets under management, which often total in the hundreds of billions and in some cases trillions. These funds not only represent the retirement savings of millions of people, but their massive asset bases make them extremely influential institutional investors. And that commands significant sway over financial markets and the strategy of Wall Street firms. So that one, I was like, I can answer that one right off the bat. And then there was a great question from Richard around, do you have recommended guidelines for proxy voting that state pension boards can adopt? And I am going to pop this one over to Allie, and I'm going to take myself off spotlight so we can do some Q&A as a group. Oh, and welcome Lindsay from Stand.earth, our director of media over there as well, can answer press questions. So Allie, I'm gonna pop it to you about these model guidelines. Do we have them?
Yes, we do. And so these are ready for language that pensions can take and shape to make sure that they fit within their own policies. So this language is already ready. And something that we added this year, we heard some feedback from pension staff that they're moving towards a more principles-based approach. So if that's you, we have new language that is more of a principles focus, as opposed to the more standard practice of listing out many details of expectations for companies. If you don't know what that means, we are happy to walk you through it if that comes up in your campaigning, but we have the language ready.
Thanks. All right. And we will send with the resources that you will be receiving in the toolkit with the report. There is a link to the model proxy voting guidelines that Ali was talking about. There's another couple really great questions too, Ali, that I think maybe you might know about. Where is anti-ESG legislation happening?
It is happening all over the country. It's primarily in states that have Republican leadership at every level, but it's not exclusive to those states, and it's happening at the federal level. So we're seeing an onslaught of bills. Many of them are just iterations on each other, and these do everything from creating blacklists of companies that are too woke, so the state won't work with them, or outright limiting the ability of public pension funds to consider those ESG factors. And as I alluded to earlier, they're not defined clearly. So it makes it confusing for folks on the ground to understand how these laws are being interpreted. But there's lots of great research on which bills are moving and how they are impacting states. And I will add that one of the biggest takeaways is it costs these states a lot of money to say that they're not going to work with pretty much anybody on Wall Street. So they are winning political points and costing their pensions and their municipalities a lot of administrative money to make this political stance.
Yes. Okay. I'm grabbing more questions as I see them, and I know we're not going to get to, well, we'll try to get to as many as we can, and I see them in the Q&A and I see them in the chat, so I'm pulling stuff as I see it. Ooh, Cassie, I've got one right up your alley. I bet you know which, if any, pensions have divested from fossil fuels. I think there's this weird database, isn't there?
Yeah, Amy. Stand.earth manages the divestment database .org. Super easy to remember for anyone who wants to track institutions that have committed to divest from fossil fuels. And within that, you can break it down by different type of institutions. We have pension funds as 12% of the institutions that have committed to divest. And in the US, some great examples are the New York City pension funds have divestment commitments and are working on divesting from fossil fuels and reinvesting in climate solutions. So I definitely recommend checking out the Comptroller's Office for New York City. They have a great climate finance tracker where you can see how their divestment progress. And then, of course, there are states like Oregon that has had the Coal Act passed, and they are going to be working on divesting from coal. And states like California have also done things like this. So I definitely recommend checking out the divestment database for more information.
Amazing. There's another great question that I know you can answer. This is a good one for us. Are there any strategies to find pension members to build support in our community or state?
Yes, yeah, I'd recommend joining the Climate Safe Pensions Network. There's folks all over the US who are organizing for their pension funds to take climate action and take climate safe investment approaches. And many of these groups do include folks who are public employees or retirees and beneficiaries. So if you are a public employee or retiree, you can connect with other folks who are pushing their pension fund who holds, their retirement money to do better. And I think, of course, you can also check out a Sierra Club chapter. They will have a lot of good information as well. And I know some of the Sierra Club chapters link up with different groups who are working in the Climate Safe Pensions Network to push their pension fund to do better.
Amazing. That sounds like fun. And we have a great time in those meetings, folks. And our pensions network and our Sierra Club chapters, they do amazing work together and they're all over Turtle Island. We can connect you with folks in your area who are already working on this. And if they're not, then we can guide you and help you start your own local campaign and teach you all about movement building. There's another really great one that I got excited about from my friend Deborah. Allie, I think this one might be just perfect for you. How do you think the positive score for CalPERS affects the campaign and the strategy to get CalPERS and the board to divest?
Ooh, okay. So I think it's really important to know that proxy voting is something that pension funds must engage in. They might delegate their proxy voting to an external manager, but it's an inherent part of being an investor to vote your proxies and to take a stance on what responsible business practices are. And some of the other things that the Climate Safe Pensions Network and the Sierra Club are pushing for, which includes divestment, require a lot more leadership from our public pension funds. It might be something that they are less familiar with, although we can point to many examples where public pension funds have divested from other industries or on other principles, whether that's geopolitical, if it's from tobacco. And so there is precedent, but it isn't a same like muscle reflex as proxy voting, which happens every single year. And I think something that you can really highlight is if a pension fund is strong on engagement, that means that they have folks on their staff and on their board who really do understand that climate change poses a risk. And that means there's an opening to have longer conversations about what else the pension fund must do to address those risks. And then for CalPERS, we did not track all of the resolutions they voted on at fossil fuel companies, but to recall that slide where we looked at the director level accountability, I think it's really important to look at, are the pension funds applying that same level of engagement pressure to fossil fuel companies, and to have hard conversations about whether or not they're having success in those engagements, and then start to have that divestment conversation. But I do know that this is something that Cassie breathes in and out every day. So if you want to add on to that and how you navigate those conversations.
Um, yeah, I mean, I think Ali, you covered it. I think as we always like, there's really good reports that show that like engagement versus divestment, it isn't like one or the other. They're used together collectively. So if there's a certain point where an institution isn't actually engaging and that isn't having an effect, or that the fossil fuel company isn't developing a good transition plan, then divestment is the next step. So I think it's good to just look at this as a ladder of almost engagement that you can use in your campaigns. And engagement might be a place to start. And if that isn't working, move on to divestment.
Yep. That's exactly it. And there's this chat is on fire. Y'all, we are not going to be able to answer all of these, but I am going to save the chat and save the questions so that we can address a lot of this in our follow-up email. But there is such good stuff going on over in this chat. And there's a couple here I want to address about California. This is a common misconception that a lot of pension funds and decision makers use is that they tell their folks that divestment is going to cost retirees money. And that scares them right into submission. And the thing about that is that's completely untrue. I'm going to share in the chat. There is a fabulous report that we did a couple years ago with the University of Waterloo that talks about how U.S. public pensions could be about $21 billion richer had they divested, from fossil fuels. A decade ago. And CalPERS and CalSTRS are right in there. There's some lovely charts. The report is amazing. So that we're just going to trounce that argument right there. It is actually more financially prudent and, in our opinion, more aligned with fiduciary duty to divest from fossil fuels rather than stay invested in such a volatile market, gambling with the working class's future. So that's not something we don't do that over here. And then I see a great comment about engagement from Massachusetts. Sia says, in Massachusetts, the emphasis is on engagement and not divestment. This does not seem to have had much of any effect on movement out of fossil fuels. And that is definitely we hear that. And that's where, I want to highlight that it's not always about engagement and it's not always about outside game. There's inside game and there's outside game. And in this kind of, political climate and working on divestment for so many years, you have to tailor your ask to your audience and you have to meet these pension, employees and these trustees and the boards where they're at because everybody is hit with a massive amount of misinformation daily. And what we aim to do and why we do these jobs every day is because this is based in fact. These are based in numbers, the data, the research, everything points to this. And we know from experience that we don't have that much time and we need to move this money so that we can protect our retirement futures and protect the planet at the same time. So engagement is a great tool like for proxy voting. Sometimes is it a great tool on divestment? Not so much. And that's where you have to change up your tactics in your campaigning. We're coming up here. We've been doing some Q&A for a hot minute. I wanted to see if there was anything that any of my fellow panelists saw that they wanted to answer. Otherwise, I think we're gonna start to wind down for the day.
Yeah, we've had really, really amazing questions, and I think a lot of folks are putting this into practice already of how is this going to impact my campaigning. It's wonderful. And I do want to highlight that we do want you to ask tough questions of trustees and pension staff about how their engagement strategies are working or not working with fossil fuel companies. But I want to just take a step back and remind folks that this is a practice they have for the entire economy. And there are many sectors that have the ability to transition to a clean energy future, and it's a much more straightforward pathway, whether that's a utility company changing where it sources its electricity, or a steel mill adjusting its practices so that it relies on clean energy. We need investors like public pension funds to be pushing across the economy on engagement. So this is a much broader strategy than just focusing on the biggest polluters, but we love the engagement and folks taking this and running with it. So I just wanted to say there are a lot of sectors we care about, and it's a lot of information, and that's why we've put together this report to really highlight where the most impact can be had.
Yes. So we're gonna wrap up with some reminders here. Reminder that the report is embargoed until Monday morning, and you'll see that in any materials that you receive. But just want to say that out loud so we don't slip up. This report briefing was amazing, and I am so thankful to my fellow authors and panelists and all of the folks that supported us to get this report out. Reminder, we will send out a follow-up email. It will have all the things. It'll have links on where to join. It'll have the action hour link. We'll send you all the information and everything that we talked about today. I'm going to save this chat. and reach out to folks and connect on this stuff. So that might be the old report, Stephanie, from last year. Nothing about embargo. It might be last year's report. Sorry, I saw that in the chat and I was like, wait, no, that's last year's. So we want you to come to our action hour, and we want to write LTEs with you, and we want to help you integrate this into your campaigning. We want to help, folks unpack this. And also, I've been seeing a lot of talk in the chat about retirement funds. And that is something that is upcoming this spring too, that we will be collaborating on, is supporting folks in getting their own retirement funds, 401ks, 403bs, that sort of thing, into climate safe investments. So keep your eyes out for that, because it is coming this spring, and we will let everybody know. It's not just about the pensions, it's about the retirement funds too. It's solidarity in the working class. And this report is so amazing, and we're so excited to share it with you. Thank you for joining us today. And we hope to see you on the February 20th webinar. Thanks.
Thanks all.